Hello, Josephs. It's amazing to have you on my podcast. You're one of the not many reformers to be on my podcast. I think only two so far with you. What do you think is the reason not many people are actually willing to run for Reform Party?
Well, I'd say, if you look at the local elections, it's sort of the opposite. We've got the highest number of candidates out of any political party, and we're expected to do better than any other political party. But I think one of the things with Reform is that because it's such a new party, a lot of the people running have never done this before. And there are a few of us who perhaps have been in politics a little bit longer. But the majority of candidates are not in it for the same reasons as other politicians. They're not in it to get media attention, perhaps to make a name for themselves. They're just in it to actually do some good for their local area. They feel like the country is broken and they want to fix it. And their way to do that is to set aside their time and their work for a few months and try and run for local council in this case. And I think that's one of the reasons why, as yet, a lot of people aren't sort of gravitating towards media because they're not experienced with this stuff, right? We're not a media-focused party. We're a party that's focused on fixing things. The other parties like to promote. They promote a lot, but we feel like they don't do as much. We want to be the other way around. We want to do a lot of things and not talk too much. So, that's one of the reasons, but also just the fact that it's such a young movement. I mean, this is a party that's only a few years old. We've just had our highest ever vote share at the national election, our first MPs in Parliament. I mean, this is all very new, and it's only going to grow, and I'm sure you'll have a lot more reformers in the future.
On my podcast. At some point, maybe Nigel Farage. But let me ask you this. You are running a media consultancy agency. And so you've been dealing with politicians for quite a while now. So what was your reason to be in politics?
So I run, yes, it's media and political consultancy. So I do a lot of work in public affairs, public relations, all this kind of thing. And I guess my reason for stepping back and running is because for the first time, I feel like I can make a difference. I've been in politics for about 6 years, maybe slightly longer. And over that period of time, predominantly working with people in the Conservative Party, I've always felt like there's an element of what I was just saying, really, which is that there's a lot of talk and very little action. And for the first time in my political career, I feel like Reform are different. I feel like there's a difference in the party. There's a difference with Nigel, with the way the party works. They're a lot more open to ideas and they're a lot more open to real change. And actually, one of the things that encourages me the most is how many entrepreneurs are involved in Reform. So I'm an entrepreneur myself. I run my own business. And I look at, particularly in the upper echelons of the party, how many entrepreneurs are being attracted to Reform. And that's because they feel like Britain as a whole doesn't work for small and medium-sized businesses. It doesn't really take into account entrepreneurs. It doesn't take into account tech and all the industries that we should be getting into as entrepreneurs. And Reform really does that, right? So Reform is looking at new forms of policy, new forms of communication, and also the social media elements of what Reform does. This is a huge thing. It's a huge step in the right direction, in my opinion. Not only because it's partly what my company does, but also because I feel like that's the new communication frontier, especially for young people. So obviously young people are far more engaged on social media than anywhere else, and Reform has recognised that. And so that speaks to myself. I'm still on the right side of 30. And to my generation, that's all we've grown up with, right? And I'm sure you're exactly the same. So seeing Nigel Farage, knowing what TikTok is, and understanding the social media game gives me hope that we can attract a new generation of talent as well. So those are some of my reasons. I think the other thing is when you work in politics, you get to see the worst side of it, and you get to see the payouts and the mild elements of corruption. Not as bad in this country as some other countries, but it is still there. And Reform aren't like that. They're not taking sneaky backhanders to try and go and build something for their mates' development somewhere in their part of the world. They're not taking donor money to go off and do things. They genuinely they want to fix the country. They're reinvesting the money they make into campaigning, into trying to win. And that's another thing that gives me a lot of hope.
Well, it's interesting that you say Nigel Farage, as the leader of the party, is much more accepting to the ideas that the Tory party that you've been largely collaborating with over your political career. Because in news now, the opposite is being said about Nigel Farage. What's being said about him is that he's a large narcissist. He doesn't take opinions of his party members into account. Especially, I think it has been highlighted by the media during his conflict with Rupert, who is, I'm sure you would agree, a very important person for the party as well. What's your stance on that? How is Nigel Farage looking as a leader, and has this situation with Rupert undermined him?
Yeah, so I think the thing to remember is where Nigel stands in all of this. So Nigel as a character, as a political figure, is someone who has had and achieved political success for 30, 35 years now in this country. It's a lot of capital, a lot of political capital that he's built up over the years. And so for someone to come along and essentially try and disrupt what Reform is trying to achieve under Nigel's leadership is not going to work at this stage, right? Nigel is the only guy who can win right now. He's proven that time and time again. Every time he takes to a cause, like he did with Brexit, and takes on the establishment, he wins. And so what we have to focus on right now is how we as a small party, as a new movement, win, right? And we've become already the second largest party in terms of membership. We've become the largest party in the polls overall. So you have to look at that and think, is Nigel doing something right here? Yeah, absolutely. So he's getting all of that right. To do with, the recent sort of infighting and all this kind of thing. I mean, all of that, to be honest, is, as far as we're concerned within the party, hasn't made any kind of difference. I haven't seen any difference. If I ask people on the street if they know about that, they don't know about that. They don't know about that at all. So one thing I would say is that social media is not real life, right? My constituents in Shropshire are probably a lot more worried about potholes, about fixing their local council, which is terrible in the way that it spends their taxpayer money and their finances, than they are about what's going on in the papers. They're not looking at that. They're not looking at Twitter. They're not looking at any of those things. We've moved on as a country from all this kind of petty infighting and squabbles, because this is what we saw in the Tory party for so many years. I mean, there was a point where we had a new prime minister every 6 months, which is just, it's not tenable for a country, let alone a political party. And so in Reform, what we're trying to do is create a united, cohesive message that, yes, pushes against the establishment, challenges them on certain issues, does things that have never been done before, but also speaks to as many people as possible. And you will, as you grow as a movement, you will get voices who are unwilling to follow, unwilling to be a team player. And that happens all the time. And in politics, it will continue to happen because there will always be egos who want to be the leader and take over and think their ideas are best. But what you find is that, and I'll draw a parallel here with Trump over in the US, if you have somebody who has dedicated their entire political career to a cause, and you get a newcomer who comes along and wants to challenge that leadership without any kind of political capital or credibility, it doesn't matter how good they are, it doesn't matter what they say, they're not going to succeed because they don't have roots, if you get what I mean. They're not deeply embedded into what we're trying to achieve. Trump, the second time round in his last election, had a similar issue where there was a think tank over in the US that released a report called Project 2025, and Trump disavowed it. Trump didn't want to be part of it. He thought that it was incoherent, that it didn't make sense politically, and that it wasn't the right time to be talking about those issues. And what won out was Trump. He was the guy who was going to win the movement, to lead the movement. And he left that behind him. He moved on and won an electoral landslide. And I think that's exactly what Nigel's going to do here.
And yet, do you think Trump has, in a way, followed what has been said in Project 2025? At least bits of it, because in media we get this ideas, this sense of the fact that Trump really has seen Project 2025. He's moving in the direction that it has been, willing him to move in. And the Heritage Foundation, it really raises questions whether he really had to do anything with Heritage Foundation.
That he's followed. I mean, so the problem with Project 2025 specifically is that it was an amalgamation of lots of different ideas into one document. And some of those ideas weren't going to work within the administration. Of course, there are elements that he was going to do. And again, I would say there's a direct parallel. A lot of people, mainly I think bots online on Twitter, have been saying that Nigel Farage doesn't want deportations. Right, Nigel has always said he's going to have deportations of illegals, of those who come over in the small boats. It's been in the party manifesto. There was never any question about it, right? What Nigel said a few months ago is that he didn't want mass deportations because it wasn't feasible to do it.
Because that's pointless.
It's not pointless necessarily. I mean, if you could do it, fine. But economically, first of all, how are we going to figure out where everybody is from? We've got a million illegal immigrants, we reckon, in this country. How are you going to find out the nationality of every single one of those people, work out a repatriation deal with every single one of their countries, most of which are war zones without a proper government? Let's be honest.
Also, you have to supply them with food.
You have to supply them with food. Then you have to put together a plane fleet, which costs millions, charter an entire... You've got to literally fly 1 million people back to countries that probably wouldn't even work with us in the first place. It's not like America, because in America there's a southern border. So you can just ship people back over the border or turn them away in the first place. And you can, for instance, figure out something with one of your closer neighbor countries like Colombia, right? Okay, Colombia may have its issues with corruption and all the rest of it, but it's still geographically quite close to America, and they're still in constant contact with Washington. So there isn't as much of a terrible negotiating process to go through as, say, if we had to figure out a treaty with Afghanistan or South Sudan or any of these countries that are in flux right now. So all Nigel was saying is, practically speaking, we can't deport 1 million people at once. We can try, and we can certainly get them out of these hotels where they're being funded at taxpayer expense and given phones and driving lessons and all kinds of perks which we don't get as citizens for free. And you can certainly take away the strain on the NHS. You can certainly put them offshore in a processing centre, which is, what will happen. You can, get the hotels reopened for public use again. You can do all of these things. And yes, you can deport people who come here as soon as they land. You can deport them as soon as they commit a crime, as soon as they're discovered. And by the way, there's another really important thing here. If they come here onto British soil, they've already committed a crime. So when Nigel says we're going to deport criminal immigrants, he's saying we're going to deport people who have come here illegally. The way we do that has to be practical. And then in front of 10,000 people, literally the other week in Birmingham, I was there, he's called for deportations. And you should have heard the stadium when he said that, because everybody erupted in applause. Because Nigel has been consistent with this all the way through. And it's all very well as an external disruptor to come in and say, we need all these crazy ideas about sort of deporting the family of criminals and all this kind of thing. And some people have called for that. But it sets such a terrible legal precedent going forward. Imagine, you've got a criminal who's robbed a shop and they've got a family who knows that they stole a TV. Well, first of all, how do you prove in a court of law that they know that that person stole a TV? Okay, they don't. They might. You can't prove it in a court of law. And then if you're also going to arrest that entire family and deport them all, children, the grandmother, what kind of precedent are we setting as a country? Because nationality doesn't matter. If you're here as a visitor, you're not a British national, that then means that there would be precedent to deport you if you do something wrong. That idea is just totally nuts. It can't work. It shouldn't even be considered in conversation. So I think that Nigel, the party as a whole, have got this issue spot on. Yeah.
But also I think Reform as a new party has been able to handle a lot of issues well, and it's always harder to begin rather than to continue anything, pretty much. A business, a party. And of course, this situation with Rupert Love, with Nigel Farage being called a narcissist, etc., not being able to handle things well, according to some people, is of course appealing to those people who are looking into future when reform will potentially grow and will be a massive machine. So I want to ask you this: how big is the party now? How structured it is, and how easy to navigate you think it will be in future?
The people who want to put that message forward are predominantly the establishment. And by the establishment, I mean the media class, which is more or less wholly controlled by Labour and the Conservatives. There's not much independent media with the same traction as the mainstream media yet in this country, although it's growing. And certainly we can see on X that people are getting their information from other sources now. But the establishment, particularly the Tory media, want to destroy Farage. They want to destroy any challenge to their hegemony on the right of politics. I mean, I can't even call them a right-wing party now. I think they're actually left-wing. The Tories, yeah. I'd say that, yeah, and it's true. If you look at their record since Tony Blair, I mean, they've governed to the left of him on every issue, without exception. Challenge me on an issue and I'll prove to you that they govern to the left of Blair. And in fact, Cameron was the one to say, well, I'm the heir to Blair. So, they're a left-wing party as far as I'm concerned. But for the sake of this debate, we'll say that they control right-wing media in this country. And they don't want to let that slip. So the chance to call Farage a narcissist, incapable, incompetent, to call the party these things is exactly what they want. It's not true. Of course it's not true. They feared Farage for 30 years because he was the only guy who could destroy them. In 2019, they had to come begging for him. Boris Johnson had to come begging to ask Nigel to move aside. And Nigel, for the good of the country and for the unity of the country post-Brexit, said yes. And as he said, that was his biggest mistake, trusting the establishment, trusting the Tory party. So that's just simply not true. I mean, if Nigel was as bad as some people want to paint him out, he couldn't succeed. Yes, there's always going to be infighting. Yes, people have differences of opinion. And as a leader, sometimes you have to make very difficult choices about who you're going to side with. And I think so far, Nigel has done a brilliant job of being the guy who's chasing the establishment, hunting the establishment. The difficulty for Nigel now and for Reform as a party is that we're now the hunted. We're now the number one party. He is tipped widely to be the next Prime Minister of the UK. So you're suddenly in a totally different sphere, right? You've got the media attacking you all the time. You've got people looking to chase after you. You've got people attacking and tearing down your party, calling you all the names under the sun. Well, actually, that's a sign of success because they've finally woken up that we are the biggest challenge to the establishment. And people who are looking to see whether or not Reform can form a capable government. Well, I'd say this. First of all, I go back to my point about why I was attracted to the party, which is that we've got competent, educated, and by educated, I don't mean they went to Eton. I mean that they understand business and they understand the real world. Educated in the school of hard knocks, that's what we say. They understand the way that the UK works on a business level. That's why I was attracted to the party. To be able to reform the UK, to form a competent government that knows what to do, there are a few elements we've still got to put in place on the legislative side, in terms of the personnel that takes over in the civil service, in terms of how we reshape the civil service. But the actual instincts of a party to lead and run a country are all there. We have all of those people. We have the talent that the Tory party and the Labour Party are completely lacking. Completely. I've worked with, parties, politicians, individuals for years, and I have seen a consistent lack of understanding of the real world in both parties. It's not exclusive to the Tory party. And you can see it just from the front bench with the current Labour politicians. I mean, you look at their backgrounds. I think two of them have some business experience, and both of it was like running an agency or something. I mean, they don't understand the real world. Like, no one is qualified. The only guy who said he was qualified as a lawyer, apart from Starmer, actually wasn't even a real lawyer. You've got one person calling himself an economist, which he worked in complaints. I mean, you know, in the Bank of England. None of these people have any real world experience to be leading a country.
Right? What do you think about Keir Starmer, though?
Keir Starmer is very intelligent and very dangerous, in my opinion. Very dangerous.
What does that mean?
I am on record as saying that I think that basically what you have with Keir Starmer is a soft communist takeover. I think that Keir uses all of the fundamental characteristics of a socialist leader, of somebody who wants to be a petty dictator. I think that he has gone through his entire career dreaming of this moment where he can actually throw his weight around. You know, there's an old sort of saying that you shouldn't let a lawyer run anything. I know many very good lawyers, so I'm not saying that about everyone. But I think with Starmer, you see that in action. He has this kind of ego that he knows what's best legislatively. He uses the law very, very, very interestingly. He does it in a way that means he can always find a loophole. He can always find a way to justify his own decision. That's the definition for me of somebody who is dangerous, because they are willing to use legal loopholes and ways of acting that are contrary to moral order, purely to hold on to power. And we can see that from the way he tries to terrify his own citizens by throwing them in jail for memes, by the way that he is more than happy to send billions in foreign aid but won't give pensioners at home a few million to get through the winter, the way that he lies about what he's doing with the borders, and he's claiming that he's sending people back and crushing the gangs and all this kind of stuff. It's not true. Our immigration numbers have continued to go up under his watch. I mean, the Tories were basically managed decline. I would say Keir Starmer is accelerated decline. He is a whole nother kettle of dangerous. And one other thing I'd say about him, and I think it was Peter Hitchens and a few others who initially pointed this out, much to their credit, although there were others who talked about it. When Keir Starmer was a student, he was going to USSR communist training camps in Central Europe and hanging out with some of the most senior ranking socialist agitators at the time who were grooming students for the communist regime. And that's his background, and he's never disavowed it. He has never said that was a bad thing to do. So as far as I'm concerned, that's where his views still lie.
And yet, from what I've seen on his character, I mean, you know, you probably would guess that I'm not a big supporter of Keir Starmer, but from what I've seen with my ability to analyze, he's always able to adjust his character to a certain extent, especially during the external affair, during the negotiations with Trump, when we could see him hating Trump for the whole of his career, and now having to deal with Trump and having to say he's actually a good guy because the UK needs the US. Yeah. The same as every country needs the US.
He's a politician. He's two-faced, and he's very good at being two-faced. He'll greet his enemy with a smile, right? Which is what every politician has to do. But the thing with Starmer is that even though he had a good showing with Trump on paper, Trump didn't do to him what he's done to other world leaders, and he came away with saving some face. I mean, he brought a letter from the king, which I think was a genius masterstroke, because that was a way to get the more patriotic side of the country on side, to get Trump on side, because Trump loves the British royalty. But he was still going down in the opinion polls at home while he did it. People just don't buy Keir Starmer. They don't buy. I mean, this is the guy who is sold off our national security in the Chagos Islands and US national security, ostensibly to China, because Mauritius has many problems in its dealings with China. This is a guy who is prepared to give territorial, economic, geopolitical ground up to a communist regime in the CCP.
So what is he doing that for?
Why do all communists cooperate? Right? Because they're working together. Because I'm not accusing Keir Starmer of cooperating with a foreign country, by the way. I'm saying that he's simply being true to his ideology, which is socialism. Socialists will always work together. This is how they win, right? They put their differences to one side until they've won. Starmer is an odd mix of communism and globalism, right? This is a modern phenomenon. You know, the traditional hard left, the real socialists, the original Marxists, if you like, the Galloways of this world, and people who were of the old left in this country, they're actually quite nationalistic. They're actually quite pro-Brexit. They're pro-borders. They're pro-internal labour. They would totally disagree with what Starmer's doing now, because what Starmer's doing is the Fabian way of doing things. The Fabian society believed that you should slowly grab power in small increments by doing things that weren't revolutionary. And that's exactly what Starmer's doing. He's accelerating it a little bit now because he can, because he's in power. But the Fabians don't believe in bloody revolutions. They don't believe in the workers rising up and taking over. They believe in incremental change and progress over time, which is so small that you almost don't notice it. And Tony Blair did this brilliantly. Tony Blair took apart our constitution, reinvented it, and put in his own ideas. He created the Supreme Court. We never had a Supreme Court in this country. A Supreme Court that's capable of overturning the seal of the king on a parliamentary bill, or on, as we saw, the proroguing of Parliament after Brexit. And that was the first massive coup, if you like. It was the first time the Fabians stepped out of their shell and said, this is what we're all about. And now Starmer's doing the second wave of this. It's a continuation. I would go so far as to say there hasn't been a change of government since 1997 in this country, because I think the Tories are just as complicit. They didn't undo one iota of what Tony Blair did. They increased net migration. They increased net zero commitments. They didn't undo any of his legislation. They upheld the Supreme Court. They did so many things that are completely anti-Tory, anti-conservative. They essentially just continued government, and now Starmer's once again accelerating.
And there, when you criticize Keir Starmer for being willing to slowly grab power, I think it would make sense to kind of draw a parallel with Trump, as he's often being loved by right-wing people. He's very populist in the opinion of many people. And the way he's been conducting especially the previous time he's been in government, the way he's exited the government was very worth condemnation, in my opinion. The January 6th attacks. What do you think about those? Does that not demonstrate his willingness to hold on to power for as long as he can?
Well, first of all, I don't want to go too deeply into American politics because it probably deserves another hour of our time. But January the 6th for me was nothing to do with Trump. I don't think that Trump incited anyone to do anything. If you read what he actually wrote...
He just didn't stop him. That's the thing.
Yeah, but he didn't know it was happening. So how can you stop something you don't know is happening? He literally said, make sure there's no violence. Make sure that, we rise up in peaceful protest. He said all of that. The media distorts people's stuff, people's tweets, people's words, people's actions in real time. This is something we're coping with. This isn't just a left-wing thing. It's right and left. I look at the entire media class as completely dishonest. I don't know of many, if any, newspapers that, or certainly not TV, that don't put immediate spin on a story. It's crazy the level of misinformation around January the 6th. Yeah, there were some bad actors in that crowd. But if you look into who's lying dead now, that was a protester that got shot. That wasn't, they didn't start by coming in and shooting security or doing anything stupid. It turned into a stampede because somebody got shot by a guard, right? And then things went out of control. But if you look at all the video footage, there was hardly any violence. There was isolated incidents of violence, and those people are in jail or dead, depending on what happened in each situation. There wasn't like some kind of crazy stampede. I mean, you're allowed to walk into the Capitol building if security lets you, and security were letting them in. So you have to say, well, who was complicit? Was it Trump who was saying, protest, but make sure you do it peacefully? Or was it the Democrats who were in charge of the building and were allowing security to just usher people in and expect nothing to happen? I mean, if you have a controlled protest in London, you're not allowed past a certain line. You wouldn't be allowed and ushered into the grounds of Westminster. Security would stop you. You wouldn't be allowed in. So why were they allowed into the building in the first place? There's so many questions around January 6th. So I wouldn't blame Trump for that. Trump did say that the system was rigged and the election was stolen, right? And that's a whole nother debate. I don't know if the election was stolen. I don't think you can prove that right now. Maybe the evidence is out there. But I think actually Trump was almost the opposite in some ways of the Starmer-Blair thing, because I don't think Trump first time around knew how government worked. And he said this since. I mean, I don't think he realised how many people were there willing to backstab him, were willing to undermine him, to make sure that things didn't happen and use the legislature against him. If anything, Trump is an anomaly. I think the Democrats, if you look at the Democrats are very similar to what both the Tories and Labour do here, which is that they consolidate power at any cost. And they have the same 3 or 4 people advising, pulling the strings behind the scenes all the time. They're very good at continuity. Trump is not great at continuity. Trump is liable to be divisive, to have infighting, all these kind of things. And he is big enough to ride over this and create a stable kind of cabinet on top of that. But if you look at the Democrats, I would parallel them with what both the Tories and Labour have done for the last 20 years. I would also say, I would go further than that, I'd say that Tony Blair, Alistair Campbell and Dick Cheney were basically best mates, right? That's what happened. That's why we went to war in Iraq. Okay? They were all working together. I would even go further. I'd say that Biden learned from Blair. I would say that Obama taught Cameron. There's an incredible incestuous feel to the way that politics worked in the early 2000s, right? So from about 1997 until now, this is what I mean when I say there hasn't, not just a change of government in the UK, but in some ways in the whole Western hegemony, apart from Trump disrupting things, and now Nigel over here, there haven't really been any challenges to the establishment. They've all been best mates. They've all co-opted each other's policies and worked on the same foreign wars and tried to gain the same globalist brownie points. And this is the first time we've seen a challenge to the establishment. And you might not like it. You might not like Trump. You might not like Nigel. It might not be your thing. But you can't deny that they are the first challenge to the establishment in 30 years.
And to your pure delight, I'm sure, the reform is almost becoming like a trend now in the UK, here in the UK. I can almost feel like it's becoming more and more popular, especially among the young voters, who are, of course, the more it goes on, they're gonna become eligible to vote, and there will be more and more people coming to reform. I think more and more people coming to right wing because media, especially things like podcasts, things that people usually put on social media, is predominantly right wing now, and it has changed quite a bit. I think the change started from about the COVID time, when some people probably didn't believe some of the things told by media. Some of the people didn't believe that the COVID vaccine works. And I think this is quite frankly becoming a trend now to be right-wing, to be patriotic, whatever country you're from, to be patriotic, to close the borders, to be responsible to who you're dealing with. Do you think it's going to continue, or this trend is after some time going to remain in the past and going to be again changed with this wave of left-wing?
Well, this skepticism about mainstream media peddling misinformation, this isn't a right-wing thing at all. This is an anti-establishment thing. Patriotism, loving your country, liking your national flag, thinking that it's a good thing to love your country, why is that exclusively a right-wing thing? I mean, it never was. I mean, if you you look at the way that communist propaganda worked, it was centered around a love of nationhood and community and all the rest of it. Now, there were obvious deep issues with communism that made it impossible to follow. But left-wing agitators, until really the sexual revolution, were generally quite nationalistic. There wasn't this weird divide between your right wing if you like your country and your left wing if you don't like that. That never existed.
I don't think it really exists now.
It doesn't, and this is my point, right? If you look at, we're always going to have to mention him at some point because it's a politics podcast. If you look at Hitler's rise to power, he duelled these two things, right? And he was a very, very clever orator because he managed to get the left and right behind his cause, which is why when he started turning into a madman and killing people and going to war, people still followed him because he had managed to bring together some of what we would call traditionally the right and the left. And so he appealed to the nationalists and the socialists. So I think he appealed to both the nationalists and the socialists, which is why he created National Socialism. Now, because Hitler was so evil and a monster and created chaos for millions of people, what the left have done since then is attach themselves to the idea that being pro-homeland, being pro-patriotic, must be somehow equatable to Hitler, right? You see this disconnect all the time where left-wingers, typically of a certain variety and a certain appearance, will shout things in the street at people who support reform.
What do you mean? What's the appearance?
I couldn't possibly say. I would say they need to get a shower. That's probably the common denominator among all of them. But they'll shout fascist, dictator, right wing, all this kind of stuff. You're Hitler. I mean, none of it's true. None of it's true at all. I had this happen to a friend of mine who's a candidate, and she's Jewish. so that backfired.
Quite funny.
Yeah, and so none of this stuff means anything. It's all, we've grown up with this world where everything could be racist, everything can be misogynistic or fascist or any of these terms. If you dig deeply enough, I mean, milk can be racist now. You can have all of these weird and wonderful ideas that the hard left now come up with. The point being, cutting through all of it, is that these labels don't mean anything. If you go down to the local pub, any town in the UK, 90% of the people in there are going to agree with you on 90% of what you say. There will always be 10% of difference because we're all different. But your average chap or lady down the pub is probably going to agree with most of what you say when you break it down and when you explain it. And the polling backs this up. I mean, 70% plus people agree with Reform's stance on immigration, higher on other issues, particularly on illegal immigration. Net zero, no one wants to fund it. There's a lot of people who think it's a good idea because they want clean energy. But when you ask people, would they be willing to foot the bill for it? They say no, more than 70%. Reform's manifesto is essentially just a collection of common sense ideas that everyone agrees with. And we've got a very charismatic leader to actually convey them now. That's the only difference. These ideas have always circulated. People have kind of known what the problem is for about 10 years now, but there's never been a spearhead and a movement to push those through the door into number 10. And now there is. That's the difference. So to go back to your original point, I mean, this whole left and right thing is nonsense. And particularly young people see that, right? They're tired of this rhetoric of being labelled and called different things. They're tired of woke. They're growing up. They're growing out of woke. Woke existed for a very, very small period of time. It will be consigned to a horrible page of the history books as something that was essentially, a 50-year project, and it failed. Critical race theory, going to be in the bin. I mean, Labour are trying to push it. They've got 3 years left to do this stuff. So they're pushing critical race theory. They're pushing gender identity dysphoria on children. They're pushing all of these things that, it's basically like when a football player is sort of 45 years old and still thinks they're the best in the world. They're not. They're too old, right? It's done. Everyone's forgotten who they were. That's basically where woke is at, because the youth want something fresh, something positive. They want to take their country back. And only reform offers that right now. There's no other options out there.
And to kind of wrap this up, what are the things you're planning to achieve in your campaign for your council?
Yeah. Well, my local area, one of the biggest challenges for us is, as always, the council is terrible with how it spends its money. It's very wasteful. Resources disappear all the time. We've got a team of pothole consultants who are on £1,000 a day collectively. Well, Shropshire has the worst roads by ranking in the country, pretty much. We have over 35 or 36,000 potholes around the county. One of my own constituents can't get around on an electric wheelchair because there are potholes and cracks in the pavement, let alone the road. This is the pavement where he tries to go down the side. So we have basically the issues that emerging or third world countries normally face in what is meant to be a first world country.
And what you're quite frankly paying taxes for.
Right, and my promise to everyone who votes for me and for reform across the entire county is that on day one we will open up the council records to the taxpayers and tell them exactly where their taxpayer money has been spent and where it will be spent going forward. We're going to have far more collaboration with taxpayers. We're going to be getting them in for consultancy to see what they want to happen in their local areas. We're basically going to be doing everything that the council should have been doing for the last 25 years and has failed to do. We're going to fix the potholes on day one because the contracts they give out are to people on a time basis. So it's in their best interest to keep those contracts running for as long as possible. We're going to say no. You only get paid if you've done the work, right? You get your contract, and your contract is going to run to X, and we want to see this progress in this time period, and you get paid to do that. And if you don't deliver, you don't get the contract next time around. It's really simple. We're going to do things like reducing waiting times, CGPs, and waiting times for ambulances. I mean, this is more of a general election issue, but I'm horrified when I look at ambulance waiting times in our county. We've had waiting times of 10 hours plus for an ambulance. People have died waiting for an ambulance. So again, and those, thank God, are, not that often in terms of stories, but the average wait time is still hours, right? It's insane. And we had
it's not normal.
A baby who had a seizure, this was a few years ago now, and had to wait, I think, about 4 or 5 hours for an ambulance. A woman with a broken hip who had to lie for 9 hours in the street. Again, these are horror stories. These are not stories that you expect here in the UK. And our Lib Dem MP, Helen Morgan, who has abstained from voting over 700 times in Parliament, is absolutely content to take lovely photos with people and appear on the street and pick up some litter and refuses to see what the council are doing. I mean, it's a Tory-led council, so she's not entirely to blame. But there are a ton of Lib Dem councillors, and they're hoping to win the council this time. Well, what have they actually done? Nothing. We live in a rural county. They are trying to put more subsidies and more green taxes on farmers who are already burdened beyond belief. We've got issues where they're not building enough infrastructure to keep up with new housing in my town. So, we don't have enough GP surgeries. We don't have investment in the local sports centre. So there's a pool, an outdoor pool in our local sports centre that has been derelict for over a decade, I think now, must be. And that's become a biohazard because there's water building up in it that no one's changed. I mean, we've got things. I saw a house the other day that had been left to essentially rot for 20, 30 years, and the council still hasn't stepped in to do anything about it. We've got trailers on the side of an A road, a main road, that have been there for, again, probably decades at this point, with potential fuel contamination, potential biohazards, all this kind of stuff. And the council refused to act. It is an incredibly depressing state of affairs, and we can only make it better. Because we will change things on day one. There's not going to be any cronyism. There's not going to be any taking money for the sake of it. We're not in it for salaries. We're not looking to get paid hundreds of thousands of pounds, which is what the council CEOs get paid around the country. We're looking to come in and make a difference. I mean, I'm busy. I've got a business. I'm starting out in my life. I've got all of this stuff going on. And I've put my life essentially on pause to go and campaign because this is how much I want to take back my local area. And that's a story that's consistent across all of our councillors. That is not the same in other parties. They're careerists, or people have grown up in their party thinking that they want to do something. And a lot of them are good people, don't get me wrong. But they're not doing what we're doing. They're not trying to change things for the better. And yeah, so what I would say is I'm doing this because I love my town that I grew up in. I've known that town for 20 years, right? I grew up there since I was about 8 years old. And the decline I've seen, the amount of businesses shutting on the high street, the amount of poverty, crime happening, the lack of opportunities for young people, the lack of investment in sports and infrastructure, the lack of investment in doctors, surgeries and dentists, the lack of police on the streets. There's so much lack in our area. And rural communities, rural towns are particularly badly hit comparative to what you see. I mean, you don't see it as much in London, as an example, although crime is terrible. And in Birmingham, they can't even collect their bins, apparently, right now. But the rural towns are the ones that are being hit the hardest, and they're just getting left behind. Levelling up didn't work. It didn't happen. The Lib Dems are full of hot air. Labour are non-existent in my area, thank God. People are sensible enough. So it's up to Reform to come in and fix all of that.
Well, I'm glad you finally introduced your plans once again. But thank you so much for your time. It has been an amazing opportunity to interview you.
Thank you for having me.